over the dark night. She reached up to the sky of stars and caught the red-hot light of the North Star. Opened the earth, walking with blood-soaked feet. She challenged the whip, the gun, the knife. She challenged the fire, pulled from the bodies of slaves, made into laws, prisons, and courts. Screaming white-hot flames and agony, she challenged millions of headhunters, dragging and ripping apart impossible tender moments of time, shipping vessels of history, ancient history, destroying the fabric, the godlike claw of destiny of a people with a gun, a knife, a cannon, building the hideous wall of blood.
Greetings, and as always, welcome back. Thank you all so much for joining me today. And as you all, I'm sure, are aware by now, the hat means I got to get a haircut, and I didn't want you all to see how crazy I can look when in need of a haircut, so hence the hat. The genocide in Gaza has torn off the West's human rights mask. This naked colonial violence demands a new path where rights are won through people's struggle, not granted by the very states that deny them. How do we get there, and what does all of this mean? Let's connect some dots and find out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
Welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with Dr. Wilmer Leon, and I am Wilmer Leon. With each show, my guests and I provide insight and analysis into current events and the broader historical context in which most of these events take place. Let's quickly look at a couple of today's headlines. First, there's an interesting piece in the Washington Post. Secret meetings between FBI and Ukraine negotiators spark concern. FBI Director Kash Patel and his deputy Dan Bongino met with Kiev's top peace negotiator amid a U.S. pressure campaign to end the war. Before I go further, I think it's important to ask the question, what business does Kash Patel or Dan Bongino have serving in these positions? Both are clear examples of the Peter Principle. People being promoted to their levels of incompetence. Now back to the story. Over the last several weeks, President Volodymyr Zelensky's lead negotiator, Rustem Umerov, flew to Miami 3 times to meet with Trump's top envoy, Steve Witkoff, and discuss a proposal to end the near 4-year conflict with Russia. During his time in the U.S., Umerov also held closed-door meetings with Patel and Bongino. And this is according to 4 unnamed people. And that right there should tell you something about the story. Anyway, the meetings have caused alarm among Western officials who remain in the dark about their intent and purpose. Some have said they believe Umarov and other Ukrainian officials sought out Patel and Bongino in the hopes of attaining amnesty from any corruption allegations the Ukrainians could face. But wouldn't that decision come from the legal side instead of the investigation side? Anyway, others worry the newly established channel could be used to exert pressure on Zelensky's government to accept a peace deal proposed by the Trump administration containing steep concessions for Kiev. Steep concessions. Well, when you're getting your hind parts whooped, I think just about anything that results in a cessation of violence and fewer deaths should be something you might want to consider, especially when, as Lil Marco admitted, Ukraine is the proxy here. So why this meeting? Why this story? Why now? Well, folks, remember, there are a lot of forces and interests in this country and in Europe that do not want to see a peaceful settlement in Ukraine. Stay tuned. I'm sure there's a whole lot more to follow. Judge bars ICE from rearresting Kilmar Abrego Garcia at his check-in. The agency indicated that Abrego was subject to arrest shortly after U.S. District Court Judge Paula Zinnes ordered that he be released. Remember back in June, remember the statement, quote, Kilmar Abrego Garcia will never go free on American soil, end quote. That statement was made by Tricia McLaughlin, spokesperson for the Department of Homeland Security in the Trump administration. She made the statement in June of 2025. Well, Trish, contrary to your grandiose bluster, Kilmar Abrego Garcia today walks relatively free on American soil. Y'all might get him tomorrow, y'all might get him Sunday, but as I speak to you today on Friday, Trish, Judge Paula Zinnes barred U.S. immigration from re-detaining Kilmar Abrego Garcia. And finally, Trump calls affordability crisis a hoax created by Democrats, while employers have cut 1.1 million jobs this year. This past Tuesday, Trump attended a rally at Mount Airy Casino Resort in Mount Pocono, Pennsylvania, where the focus was allegedly on the rising costs of basic goods. Standing in front of a massive banner that read, "Lower prices, bigger paychecks," Trump addressed the ongoing hike in prices and said, "I have no higher priority than making America affordable again." How does one do this in an economy where employers have cut more than 1.1 million jobs through November? That's the biggest cut in jobs since 2020 and the COVID crisis. Well, let's move on. On today's episode, the issue before us is the notion that the West, responsible for the most horrific crimes in the annals of human history, could somehow be associated with the defense of something they called human rights, was always an obscene proposition. What did Dr. King tell us in Beyond Vietnam? The image of America will never again be the image of revolution, freedom, and democracy, but it will be the image of violence and militarism. Nelson Mandela told us the United States, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. Actually, I think that was Dr. King as well. Mandela said, a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense and on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. That was also Dr. King. This is what Mandela said. The U.S. made serious mistakes in the conduct of its foreign affairs, which have had unfortunate repercussions. And if one looked at those matters, they could come to the conclusion that the attitude of the United States of America is a threat to world peace. That is what Mandela told us. With all of this, what does it mean? Let's talk to my guest. He's an editor and contributing columnist for the Black Agenda Report. He's the director of the North-South Project for People or Peoples-Centered Human Rights and serves on the executive committee of the U.S. Peace Council and leadership body of the U.S.-based United National Anti-War Coalition. And he is the author of a great piece that you can find at Black Agenda Report entitled Lifting the Veil on International Human Rights Day, How Gaza Exposed the Oxymoron of Western Values and Human Rights. Ajamu Baraka, my brother, as always, welcome back.
It's so good to be back with you. And, you know, those quotes from Dr. King, you know, they definitely laid the foundation for this conversation. I mean, it was, you know, that's what we're talking about today. That basically this notion of the United States of America having any kind of relationship, let alone commitment to something called human rights, has always been basically a lie. And the same thing when you expand that to the Western powers. The Western powers, the West became the West as a consequence of the systematic state violence through colonialism that resulted in and value being transferred from the colonies back to the U.S. And back to Europe, where you had economic development in the U.S. and Western Europe, and underdevelopment in the colonies. That relationship, in and of itself, has profound human rights implications, because when you find yourself in a situation where you have no control over your own resources, where you have no ability to exercise democracy, where your rights as a human being are not recognized, and you're subjected to systematic repression, then basically the whole relationship is a systematic, ongoing human rights violation, and that's what I tried to capture in this essay.
And you did an incredibly good job. You write, millions were murdered from Algeria and South Korea to Vietnam, Indonesia, South Africa, Central America. The list goes on, all in the name of false universalism that sought to obscure the ongoing crimes against humanity that fueled Western dominance as benevolence. And I think we can also, if we could also add Ukraine in that mix, in the context of, we don't hear them say this much anymore, but the protection of democracy. Ajamu Baraka.
We absolutely can. Ukraine is another perfect example. Iraq, the invasion of Iraq, which was supposed to be an invasion that was supposed to be geared toward liberating the Iraqi people from this vicious dictator, Saddam Hussein. They've always been able to use this notion of white saviorism, this notion that the West actually did stand up and was committed to these values that they claim are universal, that the West was in fact committed to something called international law and the principles and values reflected in the United Nations Charter. But we have seen that these notions have only been covered to provide political and ideological cover for the most vicious kinds of interventions that we have seen in human history, and especially after the Second World War, or the end of it. So what I referenced in that paragraph you just read was that in the post-war period, we've had this era that was supposed to be the emergence of human rights, symbolized in 1948 with the the Universal Declaration of Human Rights,
Mm-hmm.
that was supposed to serve as the foundational document for human rights and the foundational ideals, or one of the ideals for the United Nations. That was released in 1948, the same year that the Nakba resulted in the establishment of Israel, a settler colonial state, and the white nationalists that came to power in South Africa. So on the one hand, you have this declaration, this commitment to human rights by the international community. And we talk about the international community, we're talking about primarily by the Western powers. Most of the rest of the international community was still colonized.
Mm-hmm.
People need to remember that. So you have this declaration that was supposed to represent these universal values, while you simultaneously welcome into your ranks a government from Israel that's based on conquest and systematic denial of the rights of Palestinians, and South Africa that's based on the same principles, but in this case, not recognizing the humanity of the majority in South Africa, which were and are African people. So this has always been the characterization. There's always been the issue with Western human rights, these kinds of dichotomies, these kinds of contradictions, if you will, where we're getting ready to begin to celebrate, I guess, the 250th anniversary of the United States, and all of the propaganda that's going to be generated around that, all of the misconceptions and outright lies. But and the target will be the Declaration of Independence,
Mm-hmm.
where these same so-called founding fathers can proclaim to the world that, quote unquote, all men are created equal, while simultaneously upholding slavery, not just upholding slavery, while simultaneously owning slaves and ensuring that once they put in place their governmental structure in 1789, 1791, that it would uphold the institution of slavery. So these are the contradictions that's always been apparent with this notion of human rights emanating from the West.
This domination of human rights emanating from the West. Unemployed scholar, thank you for that super sticker again, and thank you for that $3 super sticker. Greatly appreciated. Let me throw out a couple of concepts here. And I say to my students when we have these types of conversations that we, as a political scientist, it's also important to throw in some of the laws of physics every now and then, going back to one, for every action, Newton's third law of motion, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So we had, for example, colonialism. We had the struggle against colonialism in the late 50s through the 60s and the 70s. And we wound up with neo-colonialism, that what many would refer to as flag independence. So even though allegedly a number of countries on the continent and other countries as well were able to elect their own leadership, they were able to have their own flag, they weren't able to control their own economies. They weren't able, what you refer to in your piece, let me get the language here, the value extraction process was allowed to continue. So if you could, briefly just talk about the process from colonialism to neo-colonialism.
Well, it's a process of continued domination, process that resulted in the perpetuation of the rights of the colonized not being recognized, and that their labor and resources and very lives were then subjected to being controlled, dominated by powers beyond their ability to control, beyond their national borders. Um, and when you have that kind of relationship, there's no space for dignity. That basically, you are involved in a parasitic relationship. You are involved in a relationship that we characterize as a colonial fascist relationship, because in order to maintain that dominance, your rights cannot be recognized. You cannot have any authentic democracy. You are subjected to the whims of the colonial powers. Even when you have a neo-colonial setup, where you have natives who look like you, who are theoretically in government, you find that basically they are in government and they are allowed to rule because they share the interests and the perspectives of their colonial masters. They don't recognize your fundamental rights. Yeah, they are there to facilitate the process of what I refer to as value extraction. That is, to extract from the natives, from the people, their labor and their resources, their value, and transfer that to Europe, to the metropoles, to the center, if you will, in this relationship. So, that is a relationship that, by its very nature, is a violation of people's fundamental human rights, because it's a violation of their fundamental dignity. So this is, so the forms of domination change somewhat, but the essential character continued. And that's the problem we have today, because that not only did that continue in that way, but the ideological justifications for that continued and remain very, very deep. How can we explain, Dr. Leon, the the ongoing genocide that is still being carried out in Gaza? The images of people who were being burned to death in tents outside of hospitals. The image of the Palestinian prisoner being raped by Israeli guards. The bombings of hospitals, the emaciated babies and other people who were being literally starved to death by the Israelis. How can we explain those images?
Wait a minute. Don't forget the most recent story of families being exposed to the elements, because we are now in the dead of winter in Gaza, and they aren't allowed to have tents. A lot of the equipment to protect these families from the elements have not been allowed cross the border. We can't forget that one either.
It's very, very important. And that's part of the ongoing genocidal process, because the objective is to do what? Not just to have Palestinians suffer, but for them to die.
There you go.
And so where is the international outrage? We've had people in the streets who have in fact been outraged. Well, what about the Western states? How is it that Israel still today that denies the entry of sufficient food and equipment, as you just alluded to? How can that happen without any kind of retaliation, any kind of effective response from the Western powers? How many sanctions have been slapped on Israel as a consequence of them openly violating international law? None. So how is that allowed to happen? Well, because the Palestinians are not quite human. The Palestinians are Amalek. They're subhuman. What we're seeing with Gaza, Dr. Leon, is what made the West, except now we get a chance to see it in real time. We didn't see the conquest of the Americas, where 10 million native people were slaughtered. We didn't see the images of the Africans who were brought over in the tens of thousands to labor on these lands that were cleared of the indigenous people. We didn't see the images of the brutality of the plantation.
Mhm.
Okay, but what we see is a result, and that is Europe in all of its glory, all of its civilizational glory, as a consequence of that value extraction, that systematic violation of the humanity of millions of people. So there should be no misunderstanding, no confusion, uh, no mystery about how the West became dominant. They became dominant using the methods that we see and have seen
Mhm.
in Gaza, on the West Bank. Okay, massive systematic brutality. That's what made the West wet the West. So how can we expect and take seriously any notion that these forces, these states, this civilization has anything to do with something called human rights? Is a contradiction in terms, and it should be rejected. And I think, and I make the argument in my essay that let this December 10th, International Human Rights Day. This is the day that we supposedly celebrate, and it is celebrated in other parts of the world.
Mhm.
International Human Rights Day, when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted in 1948. But let this be the year, as a consequence of Gaza, as a consequence of us ridding ourselves of all illusions about the character of the West and what they refer to as so-called human rights. Let this be the year that we finally bury this notion of Western human rights and instead embrace the idea of people-centered human rights that emanate from the people themselves, that reflect the needs and aspirations of the people, and that this framework of human rights is a framework that provides legitimacy to the notion that not only do we define our human rights, but we have the fundamental right to fight for our human rights against whatever forces are denying us the expression of our fundamental human rights. So we let this year be the last, and let us go forward and not even use the term human rights, but use the term people-centered human rights whenever we refer to this idea of human rights.
So we've gone from a conversation from colonization to neo-colonialism, and you made the point that the forms of domination change, and that then brought me to that I don't think that we would uh, serve the topic well unless we then talk about neoliberalism and talk about as another element of the forms of domination change, and neoliberalism as in the economics from the Chicago boys, the University of Chicago School of Economics, and um, Milton Friedman was the chief ideologue in that regard, because we can go from Chile to Bolsonaro in Brazil trying to implement neoliberal policies, and we see those things playing themselves out, manifesting themselves right here in the United States.
Exactly. I mean, I make the argument that, and others have also, that one can understand the evolution of fascism in the West, and in particular in the US, unless you connect neoliberalism to that phenomenon. Neoliberalism, I argue, is a form of fascism. Fascism is what? The terroristic coordination between the private sector, the capitalist sector, and the state, the merging of corporate power and the state. And that is exactly what we have seen evolve over the last few decades. Let us remember that what we refer to today as neoliberalism really became quite was characterized by the kind of policies championed by Margaret Thatcher in the UK, and Ronald Reagan. But as you just alluded to, the first historic example of that form being imposed on a people was in fact in 1973 as a result of the U.S. supported coup in Chile and the full implementation of neoliberalism, where you basically eliminated any state activity on the part of the people, where you basically took over the public sector. You remove all regulations that were supposed to be in place to support the interests of the people, where you gave complete carte blanche to the private sector, to the capitalist sector. You open up the economy for direct foreign investments from outside of the nation state, allowing powerful economic actors to come in and basically to rip off your national resources. This was an experiment that they unleashed in Chile and became the policy framework that then they intensified in the 1980s across the planet. It went from the so-called Washington Consensus to the kind of policies we saw across the country, across the nation, and across the planet. This was intensified in the 1990s under the Clinton administration, where basically financialization, deregulation, privatization, all of this took place and intensified in the 1990s, simultaneously with the reduction of the state providing protections for people's fundamental human rights, putting in place laws like the crime bill that undermine human rights, that allow the state to become more aggressive in its enforcement of so-called crime provisions. And it continued. Under the Obama administration, one of the reasons why I make the argument in the piece that administration was so incredibly aggressive was because of the capitalist crisis that unfolded in 2007 and in 2008, basically. And that the response from the state was to intensify that relationship between the private sector and the state. In fact, it wasn't even intensifying the relationship. The relationship had been established, but to basically utilize the state, the government, to bail out the private sector. Quantitative easing, $85 billion a month that was pumped into the hands of the capitalist class. And to make sure that there was not going to be any effective opposition politically, you had the soft power, you had the smiling face of Barack Obama and his message of hope that diverted people away from the fact that they were being systematically ripped off. On the international level, you had the U.S. That was aggressively undermining governments with coups in Honduras, Ukraine, Egypt. You had the U.S. military through NATO destroy Libya, the most prosperous state on the African continent. You had the U.S. working with the Saudis to unleash a war on Yemen, and it goes on and on. This was the military and political response to this crisis. That basically the elites decided that they had to begin to utilize the sector that was the most developed for them, which is the military sector, to advance and to protect their interests. There is no coincidence that you had during the same period under the Obama administration, a 2,400% expansion of the Department of Defense's 1033 program. This was the program, Dr. Leon, that authorized transferring military equipment from the military to police forces across the country. It was no coincidence that on the African continent, the newly established AFRICOM, the U.S. Africa Command, experienced a 1,900% expansion under Barack Obama with no real effective opposition, because that was Barack Obama, the smiling face of imperialism. But underneath that, when we look at the class forces, This was the consolidating and expanding the fascistic relationships that have been consolidating over the last previous 2 decades. And they came together during this crisis under the Obama administration. So I make the argument that everything we see today with the Trump process, with the final stage of the consolidation of fascism in this country, that foundation was laid by both parties. But interesting enough, Dr. Leon, we already we referred to Obama, we referred to Clinton.
Mm-hmm.
The Democrats played a major role in this process of legitimizing this process, of mystifying this process. So, what we see today is a culmination, if you will, of these processes that have led to us facing now a particular kind of U.S. neo-fascism.
And to that point, let me make a couple of points. One, I'm glad you used the word culmination, because I say to folks and I'm glad that you used the example of the 1044 program where President Obama allowed for the militarization of domestic police forces. As we now see that playing itself out in Los Angeles, in DC, in Chicago, other cities. Because I've been saying to folks for a very long time, when you get caught up in this Trump mania, you lose the clear understanding that Donald Trump is not the causation, he is the culmination. That we are seeing, he's just a much cruder, crasser, but clearer and more honest manifestation of these policies that have been implemented on us for a number of years. You referred to Obama as the smiling face of imperialism, and that takes me to Gil Scott-Heron's line, America, the international Jekyll and Hyde, the land of 1,000 disguises. It sneaks up on you, but rarely surprises. And finally, you write in your piece, colonial fascism, from mercantilism to the parasitic colonial capitalist super exploitation of the global South in its contemporary form, provided the material basis for the development of the West and underdevelopment of everyone else. In those relationships of value extraction and control, there was never any space for consideration of human rights. The humans in these disregarded nations never had any rights that the colonists had to recognize. That took me to Dred Scott and Taney telling us that Africans in America had for more than a century been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. He was bought and sold and treated as an ordinary article of merchandise and traffic whenever a profit could be made by it. So whether we're talking about Africans in America, whether we're talking about Black South Africans, whether we're talking about Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank, or whether we're talking about Native Americans in this country and in other places around the world, the mindset has never changed.
And I would suggest, and you're absolutely right. And when you look at that decision, and you go beyond sort of sociological commentary that he made, and look at those other elements in terms of the interpretation of the law, the result that Cheney came to was that under the U.S. Constitution, there was no basis for anything, any rights that an African had. An
Right.
African in the U.S. was not even a whole person. And so, in that sense, in terms of the legal application of that, he was correct. And that's another one of the contradictions we have with this legal apparatus, this legal approach to human rights. That you know this construction of white power, and that's what we have when we talk about the establishment and the evolution of the U.S. state or the territory that became the United States of America. At the center of this, and as you alluded to a moment ago, at the center of the construction of the U.S. and the West is the idea of white power, the idea of white supremacy, because these states provide the material basis for the expression of white supremacy.
And wait a minute,
You
wait a
know,
minute, wait a minute, because to that point, when in October at a rally at Madison Square Garden for Donald Trump, you have this so-called comedian calling Puerto Rico an island of garbage floating in the Atlantic. When you have J.D. Vance promoting this just utterly silly, racist, white supremacist trope of Haitians eating dogs and cats in Springfield, Ohio, and then you have Donald Trump repeating that same ridiculous racist trope and calling Ilhan Omar an elected member of Congress, no matter what you think of her and her politics, garbage. And Somalis in Minnesota, garbage. You can't get any more racist than that.
exactly, and you would wonder why the so-called friends of the black people, the Democrats, would not be more aggressive in their condemnations and in their demand that Trump would apologize for those kinds of crude statements. But we didn't hear much opposition. We heard some grumbling, but that was really about it. But again, these are all the manifestations of a process of renormalizing white supremacy. See, those ideas never went away, but there's been a period in which you had to disguise white supremacy. You had to pretend that it didn't really exist, that it was that the unequal nature of black people and other people, non-white European, non-white peoples, was as a consequence of neutral processes in the economy. So it was this pretend thing that we had to engage in for years. But the Trump forces have basically stripped away that veneer. They're saying that this is a white nation. It was established based on whiteness. Manifest Destiny was an expression of that commitment that God made to white people to march from one sea to shining sea, killing and murdering and raping the indigenous people, and that this is something now that needs to be recognized. And not only do we recognize the U.S. as a white nation, look at the comments he made a few days ago in jest, about immigration, talking about why can't we just bring in some Norwegians, some good white people,
well,
some
as
good clean
he's bringing in white South Afrikaners.
You alter the immigration policies, but you allow the white South Afrikaners, the minority oppressors, Elon Musk people, to be able to immigrate into the U.S. This is a dangerous moment. People seem not to completely understand it. And look, one of the things that's dangerous, that's so interesting and dangerous about the pivot that they're making towards Somalians is this. You got some unconscious black people who still want to believe that there's a benevolent massa and that they're going to be protected, not understanding that the basis is being laid for a cross-class white supremacist coalition. Okay, and that's one reason why you don't find too many white Democrats really taking adamant and strong positions against what's evolving, what's developing here in this country. They think that the target right now are the undocumented, or what they might refer to as the illegals. Um, you know, Not understanding that this is the first step, and they're coming toward us. And the bridge, I would argue, Dr. Leon, from the immigrant communities to us is Somalia, the Somalians. You know why? The majority of the Somalians are what? U.S. citizens.
Yes.
You think that you're being protected because you are a so-called U.S. citizen? One, they've now said it's constitutional to racially profile. Secondly, you need to be reminded that there's a whole group of Americans that ended up in concentration camps during the Second World War who were Japanese. Okay, and so they move toward criminalizing the African, citizen or not. The foundation is being laid. They're coming for us. You need to understand that. And there's no masters out there that's going to come to your aid. We've got to be in a position to be able to protect ourselves if we want to survive this phase of fascism. And we are in it. It's going to get intensified. It's going to continue before it gets better, And so, I know it might sound frightening to some people out there, but we can't play with this thing any longer. We are facing the most intense existential threat we've ever faced as a people, and really as a global people, because it's quite clear that these European forces, when I say European forces, the US and Western Europeans, who have been dominant for more than 500 years, they have decided that either they're going to continue in their dominance globally, or they're going to blow up the entire world. This Trump administration and its incompetence and recklessness represents an existential threat. The situation with Ukraine, the kinds of reckless policies they've been pursuing there. This rhetoric coming out of Western Europe talking about the pending war between Europe and the Russians. This notion that a war with China, which in the U.S. is inevitable, and on top of that, people are making an argument in some of the foreign policy communities and in the Pentagon that a first strike nuclear war is winnable. So these folks are completely mad, and that we've got to understand and deal with. This whole notion now that reflected in their national security strategy, that is the Trump administration, in which now they're going to reassert themselves in the Western Hemisphere. The continuation and development of a Monroe Doctrine 2.0, with the Armada assembled on the coast of Venezuela, and with the U.S. asserting that they have a right to basically dominate the entire Americas region. This is insanity. And it's not being opposed, even among elements of the left. They think that they are falling prey to the notion that what sustains the process in Venezuela is supposed to be the dictatorship of Nicolas Maduro. No, they have a revolutionary process. Whatever issues, contradictions they have internally, they have to deal with themselves. But this notion that they're going to be able to fly in Maria Corina Machado, right, and to put her in the presidential palace and you have stability is absolute nonsense. It's going to inflame the entire region, and they're going to be stuck in a quiet quagmire. So, the fact that there's not more opposition to this really demonstrates how precarious our situation is. Because when they start coming after us more systematically, who do we have to turn to besides ourselves?
3 points, and then the final question. Point one, you mentioned the Japanese during World War II. Well, the basis of Japanese internment was the attack on Pearl Harbor. And Korematsu in Korematsu v. United States, where he was challenging that racist doctrine, the result was the court held it was in the state interest at the time to intern Japanese Americans
Yes.
into internment camps. Well, weren't we fighting the Italians? I mean, well, let me put it another way, not the Italians. Weren't we fighting Italy? Weren't we fighting Germans? So why weren't German Americans interned? Why weren't Italian Americans interned? And I believe this quote is correct. Roosevelt was asked that question, and his answer relative to the Italians was, well, they're just a bunch of opera singers. We're not really concerned with them. What he was saying in that quote was, they look like me. They're white. They're not other. Therefore, I'm not nearly as concerned about Italians, and I'm not nearly concerned about Germans because they're European like I'm European. To your point about Somali Americans, that's one of the reasons why Donald Trump is going after birthright citizenship in the 14th Amendment. Those Somali Americans are one of the targets that he will go after if he is successful in diminishing the power of birthright citizenship in the 14th Amendment. And the final point, and then here's the question. The final point is, a lot of folks look at Europe and Russia and they try to, they're confused, they're baffled, because when you look at Vladimir Putin, when you look at his spokespeople, you say, wait a minute, these are white folks. Why is it that Europe is so intently fighting white folks? And I think the answer is because Europeans don't consider Russians to be white. They consider them to be Slavic. And their white supremacy is dictating their reaction to these Slavic Russians. They don't consider Russians to be white. So with that being said, you are more than happy to take issue with any of that. But the question is, to your point, what do we do now? After all of what we've discussed and all the linkages, dots that we've connected in all of this, what do you say to T-Bone, Lil Man, and Ray Ray that are out here doing what they're doing? What do we tell them?
Well, we try to win those elements over, because if we're going to be able to survive, we have to have this element of our young people who are here basically advancing the agenda of the oppressor by undermining the cohesion and integrity of our communities. We've got to be able to win them over, and for them to understand that their historic responsibility is to be with their people, is to be in a place where we can protect the interests of our people. And so we have to make the argument that we've got to organize ourselves. We have to build effective, independent institutions that will allow us to be in a place where we can feed ourselves to the extent possible, where we can provide our own methods of healthcare, where we can engage in creative plans around how we house people. How we become food sovereign. We have basic existential challenges we have to engage in. And so what we have to do is build organizations. And it might sound mundane or whatever to most people, but you can't name a people who have been oppressed and who have liberated themselves that didn't do it through the method of organization and struggle. We can't struggle without effective organization. We're not going to build effective organizations as long as we are under the illusions that the U.S. state is our friend and that ultimately they're going to come to our aid and protect us. They're not going to do that. Gaza and the Palestinians should be a dramatic wake up to that. that despite the fact that there's significant support for them around the world, when push comes to shove, if they didn't have the ability to protect themselves, then they will be completely wiped out by now. Don't be confused by that, okay? And that's why right now they're trying to get them to hand in their weapons. They don't want them to have the ability to be able to protect themselves. So we are in a situation now, Dr. Leon, where the basic elements of survival is on the table. And it doesn't mean that we're going to be reckless. It doesn't mean we're going to be adventuristic, but it does mean we have to have these serious conversations. And we've got to, at least at minimum, come to the position that we've got to have more effective organization. Okay. And we can't play with this any longer in terms of not understanding the terms of struggle and understanding that we are, in fact, in a war we didn't ask for, but one that's been imposed on us by an element that has, in fact, demonstrated that they are, in fact, our enemy. And while it may be tough for some people to understand that the very nation state that you identify with really is your enemy, you've got to maybe rethink this, because that has been the objective relationship between ourselves as a people, as a colonized people, along with being exploited economically. That relationship between ourselves and this settler colonial state, that's been the character of this relationship from its very inception.
But
Okay?
but Ajamu, but see, man, that was history. That was so long ago. I have a degree from Harvard. I work for IBM. I make $225,000 a year, and I live in a 6-bedroom 6,200 square foot home with an 80-foot driveway, and I drive a Mercedes, I might add.
And you know what, Dr. Leon? And those elements, you know what? They have picked a side. And that's the other thing we've got to come to terms with. Unfortunately, there are going to be elements that will pick a side, and their side is not going to be on our side.
And I'm invited to APAC meetings, I might add.
Yes, they have a material interest in the status quo continuing. We are the field slaves. You know, as we watch Master's house on fire, and the house is on fire.
Mm-hmm.
This crisis that it's facing is a existential crisis. The house is on fire, and those same Negroes with their Mercedes and big jobs, they will be viciously, aggressively fighting that fire. But the rest of us watching that scene, we are, as Malcolm said, we are praying for a stronger wind. And not only a stronger wind that will burn it down, we are looking for an opportunity where we can basically ensure that plantation is done away with, because our very existence is connected to its continuation or non-continuation. That's where we are today, folks. That basically, if this plantation called the United States of America continues, then basically our situation, our objective situation, continues to be what it is today. And what it is today is continued suffering, pain, oppression, underdevelopment, and we say no, time out for that. Time out for that kind of stuff.
And the final point to that point about the house is burning, another way to put it in a broader historical context is every empire reaches the point of collapse. You cannot name one empire in the history of the world that has not met its demise. And a number of the elements that contribute to that demise are the same. It's overreach, militarism, and more overreach. And when the empire finds itself in its greatest moment of threat, it then turns even more militaristic. It overextends, its economy collapses. And there was a time when people believed that the sun never set on the British Empire. And those days are long and far gone. I'll let you close us out, Ajamu Baraka.
Exactly. You nailed it. Basically, though we are in the end days, but unfortunately, the end days will be very difficult for us for a while. But this empire is finished. And I think they know it. That's why they're trying to consolidate themselves in the Western Hemisphere. Our responsibility is to recognize that, prepare our forces, and to fight.
The last kicks of a dying mule can be the most dangerous. Brother Ajamu Baraka, as always, man, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that insight and analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Glad to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Folks, thank you all so much for listening to the Connecting the Dots podcast with me, Dr. Wilmer Leon. New episodes next week. Professor Richard Wolff is going to join us on Monday. Please follow, subscribe, leave a review, share the show. I'm telling y'all, we're running out of runway here, and we got to land this plane. And Captain, we're running out of runway. So we desperately need your help. Follow us on social media. All the links are below in the show description. And remember that this is where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge. Talk without analysis is just chatter. And we don't chatter here on Connecting the Dots. See y'all next week. Again, Richard Wolff's going to join us on Monday. Until then, I am Dr. Wilmer Leon. Have a blessed remainder of your day and weekend. Peace. I'm out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.